thank you for all coming to listen to me. As you may have know, I have argued for many years in favor of there being a cogent probabilistic argument from the most general features of the universe to the existence of God. In this paper, I will outline very briefly the structure of this argument, and then I shall go on to show, which will be a new idea of mine, and then I shall go on to show that it becomes much stronger than it would otherwise be if we adopt a certain very plausible view about the nature of laws of nature. Now, you all have a handout, which is this handout, but if you keep an eye on how I'm getting on along that, you will see the structure of this lecture. Theism, the claim that there is a God, is an explanatory hypothesis, one which purports to explain the occurrence of certain observed evidence, data, or phenomena. Many scientific or historical hypotheses are explanatory hypotheses. They purport to explain data which the scientist has observed in his laboratory, or the archaeologist or detective has discovered in the course of an archaeological or forensic investigation. To be cogent probabilistic arguments, that is, I mean, an argument which makes the hypothesis more probable than not, to be such an argument, arguments of this kind must satisfy 4 criteria. First, the phenomena which they cite as evidence must be ones which it is to some modest degree probable would occur if the hypothesis is true. Secondly, it must be much less probable that the phenomena will occur if the hypothesis is false. Thirdly, the hypothesis must be simple. That is, it must postulate the existence and operation of few entities, few kinds of entities, few properties, few kinds of properties, easily describable in terms of recognizable features of the world, behaving in mathematically simple kinds of way. We can always postulate many new entities with complicated properties to explain anything which we find, but our hypothesis will only be rendered probable by the evidence if it is a simple hypothesis which leads to us to expect the various phenomena that form the evidence. And fourthly, the hypothesis must fit in with our knowledge of how the world works in wider fields, and that is what I call our background evidence. Now, I'm going to illustrate how these criteria work in assessing possible explanations. One kind of explanation is what I call a personal explanation, whereby we explain some historical event by the action of a person or persons. Suppose there's been a burglary. Money has been stolen from a safe. There are the following pieces of evidence. John's fingerprints are found on the safe. Someone reports having seen John near the scene of the burglary at the time it was committed. And thirdly, an amount of money equivalent to the amount stolen is found in John's house. The detective puts forward as the explanation of the burglary the hypothesis that John robbed the safe. And he does this because if John did rob the safe, it would be moderately probable that his fingerprints would be found on it, that someone might report him having seen him near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed, and that money of the amount stolen might be found in his house. But it is much less probable, let us suppose, that these pieces of evidence would be observed if John did not rob the safe. Hence, the hypothesis satisfies the first 2 criteria well. But a hypothesis is only rendered probable by data insofar as it is simple. Consider the following hypothesis put forward by the defending lawyer in John's trial as an explanation of the detective's evidence. This hypothesis, put forward by the defending lawyer, is as follows. It was David who stole the money. Quite unknown to David, George dressed up to look like John at the scene of the crime, and it was really Tony who planted John's fingerprints on the safe just for fun, and unknown to the others, Stephen hid money stolen from another robbery, coincidentally of exactly the same amount, in John's house. Now, if this complicated hypothesis were true, it would be moderately probable that we would find all the positive evidence which I described. And it would remain not merely as probable that we would find the evidence if this hypothesis was false. So the first two criteria are satisfied equally well. But the evidence does not make the complex hypothesis probable, although it does make the detective's original hypothesis probable, and this is because the latter hypothesis, the detective's original hypothesis, is simple. And it's simple because it only postulates only one substance, John, as the cause of all the evidence, whereas the other hypothesis postulates three agents acting in uncoordinated ways. And so it's because of the complexity of the second hypothesis, the detective's hypothesis, postulating three separate uncoordinated agents, as opposed to the original hypothesis of just one agent whose behavior would lead to all the data. But as well as evidence of the kind which I have so far illustrated, there may be what I have called background evidence. That is, evidence about matters which the hypothesis does not purport to explain, but comes from an area outside the scope of that hypothesis. We may have evidence about what John has done on other occasions. For example, evidence that John has often robbed safe in the past. This latter evidence would make the hypothesis that John robbed this safe much more probable than it would be without this evidence. Conversely, evidence that John has lived a crime-free life in the past would make it much less probable that he robbed the safe on this occasion. A hypothesis fits with such background evidence insofar as the background evidence makes probable a wider hypothesis, for example, that John is a regular safe robber, which in turn makes the hypothesis in question more probable than it would otherwise be. The four criteria for assessing the detective's hypothesis apply generally, not merely to assessing historical hypotheses, but also to assessing scientific hypotheses consisting of postulated laws of nature. Consider Newton's theory of gravitational attraction, his three laws of motion, and his own inverse square law of gravitation, as proposed on the evidence available in the year 1687 available to Newton. This evidence included evidence about the paths taken by our moon, by the planets, by the moons of the planets, the velocity with which bodies fall to the Earth, the motions of pendula, the occurrence of tides, and so on. Newton's theory made it very probable that these very diverse phenomena would occur. It will otherwise be very improbable that they would occur. The theory was very simple. The theory was very simple because it consisted of just four laws postulating simple mathematical relations between properties of substances, between their mass, their distance from each other, and their relative velocity, degrees of all of which properties can be recognized readily by observation. The most complicated of these simple laws is the inverse square law of gravitation, that substances attract each other in proportion to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart. F equals mm' over r squared. This is a very simple mathematical function, yet innumerable other laws would have satisfied my first two criteria equally well. Within the limits of accuracy then measurable, any law in which you substitute a slightly different value for the two in distance between two inversely proportional to the distance between their distances apart squared, any number which you substitute for the 2 in this, for example, 2.00000074, would have given results equally fitting measurements within the measurable the area, the region with which measurements could be made at that time. Such an equation with this rather long power of 2 substituted for the ordinary power of 2 would have satisfied the first 2 criteria, as well as did the inverse square law. So would a theory that postulated that the inverse square law held only until the year 2969, after which a cube law of attraction would operate instead of it. It predicted just the same data within the time observed. And so too would a theory consisting of a law containing a law claiming that while Newton's law held on Earth and within the solar system, quite different forces operated outside the solar system. So there's various ways in which, and in fact there are an infinite number of ways in which you can alter Newton's theory and yet get the same observable results, which were not otherwise to be expected. But Newton's theory, unlike the theories which I have begun to postulate, was rendered probable by the evidence because it was a very simple theory. There was no relevant background evidence, no evidence from wider fields than Newton studied, because there was no known evidence outside the scope of Newton's theory making probable any other explanatory theory. There wasn't any evidence about electromagnetism, let alone about the nature of some composition of substances with which Newton's theory needed to fit. Hence, it explains so much that there wasn't anything outside the scope of its theory, and therefore the 4th criterion doesn't apply. Okay, so that's how it works in history, dissective inquiry, and theoretical physics. I now apply these 4 criteria to show that the most general features of the universe are most probably explained by the action of God, and so make it probable that there is a God. These features are that there is a large physical universe, that it is governed almost entirely by simple laws of nature, that these laws, together with the boundary conditions of the universe, which are the initial conditions if it had a beginning, together with the boundary conditions of the universe, are such as to make it very probable that they will lead to the evolution somewhere in the universe of human bodies, and an additional datum not explained by the physical laws, that humans are conscious beings. I claim that each of these 4 features contributes to the probability that there is a God, and that together they make it significantly more probable than not. Theism, the theory that there is a God, of the traditional kind worshipped by Christians, Muslims, and Jews, is a very simple thesis. It postulates the existence of one substance, one God, not many, who is essentially eternal and omnipotent. That is a person with 0 limits to his power and life, 0 limits to his life, 0 limits to his power, and 0 is a very simple number. It follows from a substance being omnipotent that he will be perfectly good. This is because to be truly omnipotent, that is, to do anything logically possible, that being must know what are all the alternatives, actions available to him to do, and so he must know what are the properties possessed by all states of affairs which he could cause. So he must know whether some state which he is considering causing is good or bad. Now, I'm going to assume a view called moral internalism, that to believe some state of affairs, and so the action of causing it, is good, necessarily gives an agent some inclination to do that action. You couldn't really believe that it was a good thing unless you had some inclination to do it. Humans who have moral beliefs, however, are subject to counter-inclinations, desires to do what is bad as well as what is good, and so we have to choose on which of these inclinations to act. But a simple, omnipotent being will not be subject to inclinations which are not entailed by his essential nature. So inevitably, God would only do good actions. There is a highly plausible principle called the Dionysian principle that, quote, goodness is by its very nature diffusive of itself and thereby of being, close quote. That is, good things tend to make other good things. It follows from that principle that God will make other good beings. Humans are good beings. We are embodied rational agents with limited powers to make the world different in various ways. And we have one power which God himself does not have, the power to make ourselves, each other, and the physical world either better or worse. If we are good parents, we seek to give our children enough freedom to rebel against us, if they so choose, but of course we hope they won't so choose. God can do no evil, but it is good that there should be a rational agent, free to choose how to exercise limited powers to act in ways that God does not choose. Limited powers, of course, so that they don't do too much harm. So there is this special reason why it's probable that God would make a world in which there are beings like us, because we have the power to make up our own minds within a limit of what to do. But if God is to create us, he must provide a universe in which we can exercise our choices to benefit or harm ourselves and each other in limited ways. For this purpose, we need a public universe in which each of us occupies a movable place, so we must have bodies which occupy places where we can get hold of each other or escape from each other, and which limit our powers, since everything we do or learn depends on our bodies, and our control of the universe is limited to what can be done by moving parts of our bodies. So we need a world in which we are embodied. But only if there are simple regularities which we can discover will there be ways in which, by my moving a bodily part in this or that way, I can make a predictable universe to myself, a predictable difference to myself or others or the world. And so we can have an effective choice of how to treat each other and the world beyond our bodies. We need to know what bodily emotions will make a difference to the world if we're to have choices of how to influence it. If humans know that by sowing seeds, weeding and watering them, they can get corn, then they know how to develop an agriculture. And if they know that by rubbing sticks together they can make fire, they will also be able to burn the food supplies of their enemies. And so they have a choice between producing good, producing harm, but they need to know the regularities, simple regularities, which they can understand about the effects of their action. Simple regularities are possible if, and I suspect only if, the fundamental laws of nature are themselves simple ones. So, if God is to create us, God must create a universe governed by simple laws. Further, if God is to create human bodies, the laws must be such as to allow the existence of human bodies, either brought about by an evolutionary process or created directly by God. And finally, if God is to create us, God must endow those human bodies with consciousness, a consciousness which controls those bodies. So, because it's quite probable that God will create us, it's quite probable that all the phenomena which I've described will occur if there is a God. But if there is no God, and on the assumption that there are no other possible supernatural beings to explain these phenomena, on the assumption there is no God and no other supernatural beings, it is immensely improbable that these phenomena will occur. There is no a priori reason to suppose that there would be a universe at all. If there is one, there's no a priori reason to suppose that it will be subject to simple laws of nature rather than being chaotic. And even if it's more probable that there will be simple laws rather than complicated laws or total chaos, even if it is a priori more probable that there will be such laws simple enough to give rise to the regularities which we can comprehend, it is immensely improbable that those laws would be such as, together with the boundary conditions of the universe, would give rise to bodies of beings like humans. And even if all this occurred by chance, as far as any currently plausible scientific laws are concerned, the laws might just as easily have given rise to robots. Consciousness is totally improbable unless there is a creator who gave it, first to the higher animals and then to us. Theism is such a wide-ranging hypothesis, it purports to explain all the most general features of the universe, that there is no background evidence. All the evidence, whether positive or negative, is within its scope, and so theism does not need to satisfy the fourth criterion. So, I've been arguing, these four general phenomena are such as will probably occur if there's a God, and almost certainly will not occur if there is not a God. I conclude that my four phenomena make it very probable that there is a God. A full discussion of the probability of the existence of God must show what is the probability on the total available evidence, and that includes the fact of suffering and wrongdoing. But solely for reasons of time, I shall not discuss that here. Now, I'm going to add a little bit, and if you look at the bottom of your handout, the little bit is concerned with different theories about what laws of nature are. And I'm adding this because I wish to argue that on some of such theories, it's a lot more probable than on other theories that there will be simple laws of nature. Now, these are theories about what it is to say something is a law of nature. What does it mean to say Newton's law of gravitation is a law of nature? Well, the first kind of theory says, well, it just says what happens. As a matter of fact, everybody in the universe does attract each other body in the universe with a force of this sort. It just describes what happens. The second kind of theory, however, says that the substances of which the universe is made have intrinsic powers and liabilities. Each body with mass in the universe has a power to attract other bodies, and a liability to exercise that power on all bodies within a certain range, proportional to the inverse power of that range. And so, if the universe started with a lot of bodies having a lot of mass, each having a mass, associated with that mass was a certain power to attract other bodies and a certain liability to exercise that power in other ways. And then, the law, to say that there is a law of nature is just to say that there are certain powers which bodies have and certain liabilities to exercise them. There is no more or less to Newton's law of gravity than the claim that each substance has such and such powers, such and such liabilities. And you'll see that, as it were, if the universe started off with a lot of bodies having powers and liabilities, then it follows from the powers and liabilities which the first bodies in the universe, the substances in the universe had, that if the universe is deterministic, all the rest of its history would follow, because their powers to make differences to other substances in respect of their masses and their powers, and so on and so on. So this theory says laws of nature concern the powers and liabilities of objects. The first theory I mentioned is called the regularity theory, and it's often associated with the name of David Hume, but in more recent times, David Lewis has developed it in a very systematic way. The theory I've now mentioned of powers and liabilities is really much older than Hume, and you do get it in the medievals, and also it has become very fashionable in modern philosophy. The third kind of theory about what laws of nature are, I call an extrinsic cause theory. Now, this theory says laws of nature are things, entities, separate from the bodies which they influence. So the world consists of bodies which can be described by a few properties, such as their mass and where they are, but the laws of nature are laws about how bodies with a certain mass operate. And they say that bodies with such and such a mass influence other bodies in such and such a way, and so on and so on. And the difference between the second and third theory is that the causes which laws of nature describe are, on the second theory, intrinsic to the substances which they describe, but in the third kind of theory, they are intrinsic. Laws of nature are things which operate on bodies. If you like to picture it, they're a sort of invisible grid filling all space. Now, this theory was often implicit in the way that scientists talk, and it's certainly been brought to the surface in various forms recently by the work of David Armstrong or Michael Tooley. Now, I have argued that it's most improbable that if there is no God, that there will be simple laws of nature. I think that these different laws of what laws of nature are make a considerable difference to how improbable it will be, if there is no God, that there will be laws of nature. For this reason, the first theory holds that laws of nature simply describe what happens, and so it becomes an immensely improbable that what happens in one tiny corner of the universe should be exactly the same as what happens in every other corner of the universe, and so exactly the same as what would happen at any other time. As it were, the events in the history of the universe are like a large series of independent tosses of coins, which it would be most improbable would occur together. And so it doesn't explain this theory of laws of nature won't explain why there are these simple regularities. So if that's the right theory, it's going to be immensely improbable that if there is no God or anything like it, that there would be an orderly, rule-governed world. Now, the second theory, however, makes it although it makes it very improbable, makes it a bit less improbable, because, as I pointed out, if you start with a large number of substances, which blend out coincidentally and so on, have very similar powers and liabilities to each other, and if you specify what these powers and liabilities are, and if they are deterministic, then the whole future of the universe is fixed. And so it follows from the very nature of the universe that the same regularities will apply in the course of time. It doesn't, of course, follow from the mere fact that you start off with powers and liabilities that they will in any way have the same powers and liabilities as each other. So there is a considerable, very considerable thing to be explained. But still, it's a lot less to be explained than on the first theory, because on the first theory, what happens after the beginning of the universe is just as puzzling as what's happened at the beginning, but that's not so on the second theory. Now, the third theory, that laws of nature are, as it were, independent things which govern the behavior of the objects in the world, the substances in the world, that does purport to explain the regularity of the universe over time. It postulates these laws as things which force the bodies to operate in the same way as is stated by each law. So it provides an explanation of why there is an orderly universe. Yes, but why these laws and why this sort of order? And there is an answer which can be provided by a defender of this extrinsic cause theory. Because if laws are postulated as things which explain orderliness, then the crucial criteria, which I mentioned earlier, of simplicity comes in. You would expect, probably, simpler laws of nature rather than complicated laws of nature. And so, although there may be no explanation of why you have the particular simple laws you do, still, it's not quite as improbable as on either of the first two theories that you will have simple laws of nature. So it does rather depend on which theory of laws of nature are true. Or rather, what does depend is just one of the phenomena to which I drew your attention. It doesn't, which theory of the laws of nature is correct, doesn't influence, doesn't make it more likely than not there'd be a universe, or that if there are laws of nature, they should be such as to produce us, or that we would be conscious. But which theory you have of the nature of laws of nature does make a difference to how probable it would be how probable it would be that the universe would be governed by simple laws rather than by complicated laws or no laws at all. And therefore, it rather would be desirable for someone who is advocating my position if I could show that the final theory is mistaken. And I believe I can do this. But can you tell me how many minutes I have left?
12 minutes.
Sorry?
12.
Well, that's enough time to do this. There is a second handout, which I think some of you may have, in which I give the argument for this. But since there is time, I'm glad to say I can give the argument for it. There are not merely inanimate causes in the world, there are animate causes. We cause things. And we explain things by the action of agents. I called this, at the beginning of the lecture, personal explanation. And personal explanation works, I suggest, by the nature of personal explanation is that there's a person who has some purpose of doing something, some belief that some bodily movement of theirs will cause that something, which they have a purpose, and also the power to move their bodies. That is to say, if I wave my hand, and that is a personal action, it can be explained by, I have the power to move my hand, and I have the purpose to draw your attention by moving my hand, and I have the belief that if I do move my hand, it will attract your attention. So the way we explain things in personal explanation is by an agent which has certain powers and certain purposes and certain beliefs that doing things with their bodies will affect that goal. And this is often contrasted with the way we explain inanimate things. Whatever account you give of laws of nature, the explanation of inanimate things is in terms of some previous state of affairs, which in virtue of laws of nature produces the subsequent state of affairs. Take a very crude example. Why did this substance expand? Well, it's iron, it was heated, all iron heated expands. So we explain the expansion of this substance by it being iron and it being expanded. And these are events which, in virtue of a law of nature, however you interpret that, produces the effect. Now, you can't explain personal intentional action in the same way, but many people have tried to do so. They have tried to say that when I do an intentional action, meaning something, to do something, what happens is that my bodily movement is caused by an event of my desire to cause your attention and my belief that waving my hand will cause it. But that isn't the same as me intentionally moving my hand, because I could have the belief and I could have the desire, and those which are states of me, internal states of me, nothing I have to do with, things I find myself with, which could trigger off the motion of my hand, although I didn't mean to move my hand. Donald Davidson gives an example of somebody climbing who holding somebody else off by a rope, and he gives the example of I may have a belief that if I let go of the rope, they'll fall. I may even have the desire that they should fall, but that may trigger off my letting go of the rope. But I may have inhibited myself from actually doing it, even though my inanimate states may have caused me to do it. So you can't explain intentional action in the same way as you explain the inanimate events. Now, causation was surely of one kind. There can't be two sorts of causation out in the world. There can't be the sort of causation by which I move my hand, which is quite different from the sort of causation by which the motion of my hand causes whatever it causes. The motion of the snooker ball cue on its ball and so on. Causation is unique, is of one sort. And given that, you will see that the second theory of the nature of laws of nature is rather similar to the kind of intentional causation which I have just been describing. Because the intentional causation includes both persons, substances, and their powers. And the second theory includes substances and their powers. But here they part ways a bit. On the second theory of the nature of laws of nature, substances have liabilities. They don't choose to exercise their powers, they have to in virtue of their liabilities. Whereas human agents are intentional agents, and they choose which purpose they will execute in the light of their beliefs. But the point is that there's a difference in species, but not a difference in genus. They're both the same sort of thing, substances causing effects in virtue of their powers. And given that there can't be two different kinds of causation at work in the world, the second theory of the nature of causation, the intrinsic cause theory, is, I suggest, the correct one. And given that, it's going to be very improbable, not quite as improbable as on the regularity theory, but very improbable that there would be simple laws of nature, because this would consist in all the stuff which the world began from having identical powers, identical liabilities to act, in the sense that every atom attracts every other atom in accordance with Newton's formula. They would have to be arranged in a certain way, certain initial conditions, in order to produce simple laws of behavior. And that's why it's very improbable. It would be even more improbable on the Humean theory, the first one, but not nearly as, but a lot more probable than on the third theory. So this is just a little qualification to my general argument. And the general argument is, to go back, there is a physical world. It is governed by simple laws of nature. These are such as to lead to the evolution of human beings. Human beings are conscious. There is no reason at all, it's very improbable that this sort of thing would happen unless there was a cause. And the simplest cause is that God, because God is the simplest kind of being there could be. He's defined just by one property which he has everlastingly, omnipotence. The rest follows from it. You won't get a simpler substance which will have a simpler substance which could potentially satisfy the first two criteria than God. And so God does satisfy it very well. You wouldn't have our universe with its properties unless there were a God, and that is my case. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, pardon. Soru alabiliriz. Hocanın kulaklığı yok galiba.
Machine, my translating machine.
Yeah. Evet. Soru var mı?
Hoş geldiniz. Merhabalar. Şöyle sorayım. Özgür irade müdafası çerçevesinde şöyle iyilik düşündüğümüz zaman, daha doğrusu iyiliğin dereceleri olamaz mıydı? Yani Allah eğer kadiri mutlaksa ve sadece iyiliğin yani sadece iyiliği yaratan, iyiliği yapan bir insan yaratsa, evet, robot bir insan olabilirdi. Peki sadece iyiliği yaratan bir insan yaratsaydı ama dereceleri olsaydı iyiliği, kötülük olmasaydı, böyle bir şey mümkün müydü?
Yeah. Well, I think it is possible and it is actual. That is to say, when we are born, there are fairly limited good actions and fairly limited bad actions we can do. But as we learn how to make big differences to the world, big possibilities open before us. And we can gradually form our own characters. That is to say, at any given time we have certain good desires and certain bad desires, but by always choosing the good, we can make us have better good desires and less evil desires. Or, of course, conversely, every time we do a good action, it becomes easier to do a good action next time, and we begin to get an idea of what a very good action would be like. and each time we do a bad action, it becomes easier to do a bad action next time, and we open ourselves to more serious possibilities. So yes, we can make that sort of difference to ourselves.
Yeah, thank you for your lectures, and I have two questions about your lecture. First of all, your discursive argument is like there is a nature and then human, and human is conscious, and that cause something that if you look to the substance, and that may lead to the God. Yes. So, if you take your, arguments, like there is a differential things that institutional religion has own of arguments of God. So it is possible to embody with institutional religious arguments, like Islam or Christianity or Jews or something else. And another question is, your discursive argument is just leading to not only to out of the institutional things, like it is just kind of like natural theology,
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yes, it is natural theology. I'm not certain I caught the message in your first question. What was your point that there's rather more than religion to religion than just believing that there's a God, in which case, of course, the answer is yes. Or was it that people do believe in God for other reasons than I've given? Which was your question?
There is institutional and formative religious feelings and experiences.
Oh, I see.
And there is really different arguments that may people,
Yes, sure.
Institutive or instinctive
Yes, sure.
thought.
Yes.
It is possible your thought to embody with, institutional religious.
Yes. Okay. I'm not saying everybody has to believe in God on the basis of my argument. It's very rational to believe in God if you have a very deep religious experience, if it's obvious to you as a result of your experience that you're in touch with God, well, you should believe your experiences. But I don't think many people have very deep religious experiences. I may be wrong about this, but that is my view. It's also rational to believe in God if the people you trust most, tell you that there is a God. They are learned people. Perhaps you trust them. There are rival views around, of course, but you have to trust those you believe those you most trust, and that's rational too. But it's only rational to believe your religious experiences and the testimony of others in the absence of counter experiences and counter testimony. And in the modern world, there's a lot of counter testimony. That is to say, a lot of people say, I've proved there is no God. Everyone knows that there is no God. Now, in the face of that, you have to make up your own mind. And I've suggested that to do so, you should take your hint from science, and that's which everybody will respect, and follow my argument. And that's designed for those people. Of course, there is more to religion than just believing that there is a God. And Christians and Muslims have disagreements about the rest of the content of religion. And I'm not going to discuss that today, but I think that can also be solved by rational argument, though I'm not going to do it now.
Thank you.
Merhabalar. Tanrı'nın varlığının rasyonel olması kadar Tanrı'nın evrene müdahil olması da rasyonel midir? Bunun temellendirilmesi bu kadar kolay mıdır? Teşekkür ederim.
Yes, no, I understand the question. I think we do have a duty to obey the commands of God if we know what they are. Yes, God being perfectly good will not order us to do bad things, but he may order us to do extraordinary good things which we would not otherwise think that we have an obligation to do. And why should we obey him? Well, because he is our creator. We owe certain duties to our parents while we are young, not merely to do what's good anyway, but to do what they want us to do. And why? And that is because they've done so much for us that we have an obligation to do something for them, even if there's no particular point in doing it otherwise. We might, if they have a business, they might tell us to help them in their business, and so on. And likewise, the state has done a great deal for us. It has provided us with a security and a reasonably just system of law. And therefore, in return for these things, it has the right to tell us to do things, tell us to pay taxes, and sometimes, in defense of the country against a just war, even to fight for this. Well, if our human parents and the state have the right to tell us to do things, they are only our very limited benefactors. All their powers come from God, and all our powers come from God. God is so much the more the cause of our existence through them and independently of them than are they, that he has clearly the right to tell us to do a lot more than states or parents have the right to tell us to do. I'm not saying that he has the right to tell us to do everything, but he has the right to tell us to do a lot, and he will, being perfectly good, he will not tell us to do what he does not have the right to do, to tell us to do.